journalist, I'm very used to starting at the top of clock, no matter what happens, so I might get started. My name's Kelly Reardon. I'm from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. We are a little like the BBC, but with far less resources, fewer people, a much smaller budget. But we're a publicly funded national broadcaster. My background is predominantly as a radio journalist, but I have been very interested in digital as it starts to flourish. And like some of you in your organisations, I'm sure, we've been having a big internal conversation about what digital means for our content and our content delivery, and also, what it means for standards. And there was a bit of a tension for a while there between legacy journalists and then the sort of so-called fleet of foot digital natives. And I was quite frustrated by this tension because to me we were having this sort of wrong conversation. So I became quite interested in how do you uphold all the best things about journalism, whether they be independence, accuracy, a commitment to impartiality in the case of my organisation. How do you protect those things but still be innovative in the digital space? So I went to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford last year to spend a little bit of time unpacking this. And really what I was interested in was what are the hallmarks of editorial quality that existed in the legacy era that we should bring forward? And then what are the ones or the new sorts of standards that some digital-only outlets have because they don't have that legacy mindset. They're not kind of constrained by the shackles of 150 years of history. And what can they teach us about quality journalism? So today I'm really going to just run through a few examples from different news organisations that might be helpful to you as you start to navigate the space yourself. I'm just going to focus today on what I think are the three most important areas of editorial quality, which are accuracy, making sure we get things right and that we're verifying our information. The second is independence. So for me in particular, when I belong to a publicly funded broadcaster, we have no Rupert Murdoch doesn't own us, so independence is incredibly important to us. No one has any skin in the game. We're not there for the advertisers. And the third thing is impartiality. So again, there's been a big debate around whether objectivity is still needed in 21st century journalism. And I've sort of thought a lot about that, and we'll talk about some of that later. So firstly, to accuracy. One of the more fascinating places I spent some time was with the BBC's user-generated content hub in London. This hub started in 2005. I think there were only probably 2 of them at the time. And fortunately for them, they set themselves up only a week before the 2005 London bombings. And if you can recall at first when those bombings happened, people thought there was a power problem on the tube, the subway. And it wasn't until a doctor who was in his office across the road emailed a picture. He must have been one of the first people with a phone that could email a picture to someone at the BBC, and it was the picture of the bus. You can remember the bus on the street with the sort of exploded top. And that was the first kind of signal to the BBC that something more sinister was going on. Fast forward 10 years and this hub is now doing amazing sort of CSI detective work, and they're using all sorts of great tools, reverse image searches, things like Pipple, Topsy. These are all tools that you can have a look at if you haven't explored them before, if you're interested in verification. They're looking at videos coming out of Syria, doing all sorts of work to verify if they're correct. And also when Saddam Hussein died, there was this picture sort of doing the rounds of his corpse, and it was the BBC UCG hub that was able to say, actually, this is a fake picture. So I think they're a really good example of how a very small team of people can verify information. And I think what's interesting is that digital, unlike sort of traditional journalism where our job as journalists was to get things right and to be accurate, I think it's equally important in the 21st century now that journalists are also debunking information and pointing out what's not real, and that's becoming part of our trade as well. So again, here's a couple of quick examples. Does anyone know if this photo is real or fake? This is from Hurricane Sandy in the US. That one's actually real. It looks like a movie set picture. But that one was where the World Trade Centers collapsed, and that picture was taken sort of obviously after the rain started falling. This one again did the rounds, you know, is it real, is it fake? This was supposedly the guards standing next to the tomb of the unknown soldier in New York. And this photo is real, but it wasn't during Hurricane Sandy. So they're just little examples of the sorts of tools that you need to debunk things that are false, but also things that are right, but actually are old as well. The other thing I think digital allows us to do, which, you know, the pre-internet era was very clumsy at, is to correct our mistakes. So there are lots of organisations now bringing much richer corrections to their work, and this is a really great example from the US. I don't know if you know Grantland, but it's a sports and culture website. To cut a long story short, they did a story about a transgender person who invented a golf putter, and during the process of the story, the journalist inadvertently outed this inventor as transgender to one of their investors. Fast forward to, you know, another week or two later, and this transgender person actually committed suicide. Grantland then had a very big internal conversation about whether they should go ahead with publishing the story. They decided that they would, and they went to quite considerable lengths to rewrite the story and thought actually that they were okay. But turns out there were many problems with the story and the way they had described this person and the sort of language around transgender. And there was a huge backlash on the internet, and Grantland very quickly had to think about, well, what do we do here? How do we protect our brand and our credibility as a news organisation when we've mucked up? But I thought they did something really great, which was to publish. The editor, Bill Simmons, published this letter, a letter from the editor. It's worth having a look at. It goes into great detail about how they checked the story, the sorts of conversations that went on in the newsroom about the story and whether they should publish. And he really does a mea culpa on everything that they got wrong. And then he went a step further and commissioned a piece by a transgender language expert, and she sort of pointed out all the problems with the story as well. It became its own widely circulated piece of content. And I think it's a good example where journalism went wrong, the standards weren't there, but someone was brave enough to admit that and to actually turn it into a success story. Worth having a look at. This is another correction I think is worth pointing out. It comes from Upworthy, who obviously are all about sharing and being viral, etc. They ran a story, I think it was about something to do with McDonald's nuggets and the quality of the meat in them. But they actually, it turned out the story wasn't right. So again, in a newspaper era, you would have published something on page 52 down in the corner in small sort of fine print saying, oh, sorry, we got it wrong. But Upworthy, I think, because they're all about going viral, decided to make their correction viral. So they issued it as a GIF. So it's, I mean, you can't see this because this is just a screenshot, but it actually is an animated GIF of the editor saying, oops, sorry, we got it wrong. It's a bit flippant. You know, you could argue that when you get something wrong, you need to treat that sort of seriously. But I didn't mind the concept of them saying, we speak to our audience in this way, this is the tone that we have on Upworthy, and we're going to match it in the style of our corrections. The other website I think is doing a great job around the standard of accuracy is Quartz. So I don't know if many of you know of Quartz, but it's a business site. It's been around since 2012. It's doing quite well. It's got a very image-heavy, mobile-first strategy. It's sort of like The Economist for the 21st century. And they're there, obviously, to compete with people like Bloomberg and the Financial Times. They're owned by Atlantic, and they have managed to learn from a few mistakes that Atlantic have had over the years. But I think what's interesting with them is that they see their space in the internet as an ongoing conversation with their audience. And so they're less concerned with getting facts exactly right in the moment and more with saying, look, we're going to be really transparent with our audience. This is what we know about this story right now, and once we've got better updates or better information, we'll post that as well. So the editor really talks about, you know, the internet is a much more fluid space. It's moving and changing, and it's a bit more like a rolling news format. Like, you know, CNN didn't feel like they had to apologise for something they got wrong half an hour ago. It was just seen as part of rolling coverage as more information comes to hand. The other thing I really like about Quartz is they have these little annotations, and it really encourages the audience, particularly if they're an expert in a particular subject, to contribute to the story. So you can say you're an expert in oil exploration and they've done a story on that. You as the expert can go along and make a little notation alongside their copy. Sorry, I thought I had an example there. But it appears, Medium do this as well, you might have seen this, but just alongside the paragraph on oil exploration, you as an expert can make a little comment or link out to a research paper or a document or something that you know about the story. So this really, I think, is what the internet is great at. It's about building more voices, more people who are experts, bringing the audience in. You know, it's that idea that your readers quite often know more about the story than you do, and it removes that journalist as God style of writing. There's a couple of things I want to talk about with regard to independence. One of them is this idea that all of the content on the internet is sort of flattened out. So unlike a traditional newspaper which had a geography about it, you knew the big important story was on the front page and you knew the features section was in a certain place that usually had a different font and certain types of pictures, and you knew where the ads were because there was a big car and it was very obvious. You know, on the internet, a lot of the content is flattened out and presented in a big mishmash where it's much harder for the audience to distinguish between types of content. I think this is really problematic and something that we need to think a lot more about. If you look at sites like BuzzFeed, obviously their business model is completely around this. It's to mesh up and mash up content that is advertorial with editorial. And until fairly recently, the signposting around that, particularly for BuzzFeed, I think was very ordinary. They've started to fix that a little. But there's lots of other websites that are doing it. Even sites like the New York Times are doing this. I think the conversation around what they're doing has been sort of lower down than what the likes of BuzzFeed and Quartz are doing. But I think the New York Times have been a little bit more clever with the way they signpost what is an ad versus what is pure editorial. So this is an example of Quartz. This is a bit of an older one of their bulletins, but as you can see up the top, bulletin by Goldman Sachs, it's clearly labelled as an ad. But on the left-hand side here, you can't really see the colour, but the sponsor content box with the Goldman Sachs is coloured in a different colour. It's sort of a yellow or something like that. But all of their ads are presented in the same editorial stream. So there's no click on banner ads. All of these stories, the football story, the in-season story, long range, those are pure editorial, real stories. but they sit alongside, content sponsored by Goldman Sachs. So whether or not you think that's a problem, I guess depends on the organisation that you work for. But I think there's still some work to do in the digital space around clearly signposting and labelling content that is advertorial or branded content or sponsored content or all the other words that are used in that way. This is an example from The Atlantic that really hurt them, and courts have learnt quite a bit from The Atlantic's example. This was sponsor content about the Church of Scientology. Their readers were really peeved about this because this story was presented like it was editorial. There was kind of a newsy style of headline and the font was the same, etc. But essentially it was an ad for Scientology. Readers got really annoyed by that, and The Atlantic had to apologise and also make some changes to the way they present their content online. This next example is one from the New York Times. So as you can see, it's labelled paid for and posted by Dell, and there's a Dell logo. But if you click through to this, it reads like genuine editorial copy. It's like, young people in the workplace, this is what they like, this is what they do, this is how they work. So it reads like a feature article. But the thing I think the New York Times have done to really, because they do take that church and state sort of separation quite seriously, is that they have made the way that you search for content different when it's editorial versus ads. So if you're trying to search for genuine New York Times journalism, that will show up in a search, whereas the ads won't, which I think is, quite clever. But of course, this is still controversial in the New York Times itself. I think this sort of sums up the kind of different approaches to native advertising. If you look at someone like BuzzFeed, they just say, look, why are we even having this conversation? People on Twitter and Facebook get all their content mixed together and they don't care, and it's a stupid conversation to be having. Others say, look, as long as you're signposting it, it's got to be part of the suite. If you want to make money from journalism, you've got to have those native ads there, but maybe what you do is signpost them clearly. And Quartz is largely praised for doing that. Impartiality is sort of one of the things that I'm really passionate about. I work for an organisation that has a commitment to impartial journalism. I think somewhere in the last few years, probably around the Glenn Greenwald from The Guardian versus the Bill Keller from the New York Times debate. I don't know if that's one that you followed, but essentially Bill Keller was saying, look, we need sort of dispassionate journalism that presents all sides and let the reader make up their own mind on a story. And then there's journalists like Glenn Greenwald, who covered the NSA surveillance stuff for The Guardian, saying, of course you can have journalism from a perspective. We all live in the real world, there's no true objectivity, etc., etc. So there's this tension, I think, and it's been a conversation that's been going on for 150 years, but what is new in the digital age is that digital does give you ways to bring greater transparency to what you do. So someone like Glenn Greenwald would argue that he's coming from a perspective, but he clearly links out to where he's getting that information from, and he's transparent about his sources, etc. Others would say you've still got to have an impartial approach. Again, Quartz is another example. So they don't see a problem with having journalism from a particular perspective, as long as, you tell the audience that you're coming from that perspective. So you're transparent about your work and where you're finding your sources and what information you've got. their editor talks about expecting fairness and that they don't always have predictability on coverage of their stories. So, for example, they talk about this example, which is when Stephen Chu, who was the energy minister in Barack Obama's government, resigned. Quartz had two very different takes on the story on their site. So some people would say, well, is that a problem? Like, if you want the story to come down where the truth is, surely you just have one perspective. But Quartz said, well, no, because there are many perspectives on any given story, and as long as we link to both those perspectives, there's nothing wrong with having two different takes on this. They didn't see it as confusing for their audience. They also Quartz talk about the difference between their site and, say, a print site, is that everyone who comes to Quartz gets a different Quartz. So unlike sort of, The Guardian or the New York Times, and you come and you sit and you pretty much consume the same newspaper as the person next to you, give or take a bit of time, when you go online, or if you're following someone via social, you're getting a particular type of their journalism. You're not necessarily getting it all. You're going in the side door via a social link. You might not get the context of other stories that exist around this one particular story. You might just be going straight to that one story. So they talk about that making their approach quite different to the approach that you would have had in the pre-internet age. Vice News are an interesting outfit. Have many people checked out Vice? I'm interested to know. So probably maybe half the room. So again, if you don't know the Vice story, they've started, as a culture magazine in the late 90s, and they've become this sort of multimedia brand, and they're very Gen Y, Gen X sort of style to their storytelling. Shane Smith, who's the CEO of Vice News, he's a bearded, kind of tattooed hipster from Brooklyn, and, he appears in some of the stories, and their style of journalism is very submersive. It's much more a street view of the world. There's lots of handheld cameras. I'll try and play you a little tiny clip because it probably gives you a better idea of what they're like. This is from a story they did about ISIS last year. I probably can't. You're not going to get the volume. So I won't go on if we don't have the volume, but you get the idea from the style that they shoot and the way, the journalist is in the car with the talent. It's very submersive is the best way to describe it, I guess. So the other thing I wanted to say about Vice is there's been a bit of a conversation about if you have that sort of style of storytelling, are you giving people the full picture? So what Vice tend to do is they go into a country sort of kind of unannounced. They're a very small operation. They don't roll in with, satellite dishes and big links trucks and things like other news organisations would. They're usually just two guys or two girls going in with handheld cameras and lo-fi gear, and then they spend a few days sort of in the area shooting what they can, and they build these little, they call them Vice News capsules, so they're short, snackable pieces of content that you can sort of digest quickly via social, but then they also have longer form sort of 30-minute documentaries which are on HBO in the States. Vice have sort of changed tact a little bit in the last year. They've got a lot more money because people like Rupert Murdoch and 21st Century Fox have invested in Vice. And so they're becoming bigger and bigger. But I think the idea of this style of storytelling, particularly on world current affairs, that is not a cold, neutral sort of reporter standing in their flak jacket describing, the blow-by-blow account of the war going on. These guys are trying to tell you the story that's happening at a street level. They have been criticised for, going in for the bang-bang. They tend to go in to Caracas when people are throwing things across the square at each other and film that and not necessarily give you the context of why, what's the geopolitical context that this little fight exists within, or what the background to it is. So they have been criticised for lacking some context. But I think the style of storytelling is much more 21st century, and it's gaining a lot of popularity with younger viewers. And they've really changed tact from, I think 5 years ago, you could probably say that Vice was stunt television to a degree. They famously went into North Korea. They couldn't get into North Korea, as no journalists can. So they said, how could we get to Kim Jong-il any other way? So they worked out that he likes basketball. So they rang up Dennis Rodman, the famous American basketballer, and said, do you want to come with the Harlem Globetrotters into North Korea and play a game of basketball? And that's how they got into the country. And they shot this little series, which again, if you watch the whole thing, it gives you a bit of an idea of life inside North Korea, but not really. It doesn't tell you why life is like that in North Korea. It just really shows you the basketball game, etc. So I think what we need with this style of storytelling is to couple it with what we would hope is quality journalism of checking out facts, of looking at context, at looking at the background, putting it in the frame for the reader or the viewer so that they understand what's going on behind this story. The other thing about impartiality that I think the internet brings us is hyperlinking. And this sounds like journalism 101, but actually if you look really carefully at key stories from most key news organisations in the world, they are not linking out anywhere near the amount that they should. I think hyperlinking is a way to demonstrate your sourcing, to back up your facts, to show your work, to show where you're getting your information from, whether it comes from a slant or someone with a vested interest. And unfortunately, we tend as journalists to make these big, bold statements, and then we don't actually show where we've got that information or that fact or that piece of evidence. So one thing I'd really like everyone to start doing more is hyperlinking and showing readers where you've got your information from. I think if you come from for me as a broadcast journalist, we did all that in the background, and that wasn't part of the story that you showed to the audience. So I think we've had to change our mindset in that how we got our information is as interesting to the audience as what the information is. The other thing I really like about hyperlinking is it brings all these different voices to the table. So I think at its heart, impartiality is about many voices, a plurality of perspectives, a diversity of perspectives on an issue. And a way to do that is to hyperlink, to show and examine lots of different ideas on one given topic. The other thing I would caution about, though, is that you can hyperlink all you want, but of course a reader only has 24 hours in any given day, and they don't want to spend it going to every single link that you have necessarily. I think our jobs as journalists are still to distill information for the audience, to pour through it and pull out the most important parts. But I think there are certain stories where you might have found some great data. Of course you should link out to that. Or you might have found a great little case study that really highlights something that you're trying to say in your story, and you should absolutely link to that. So, a little bit on standards for the future, because again, you know, how I started this was, if we have a set of editorial standards as journalists in the 20th century, before we had the internet and digital and social, do we have the same set of standards now, or are things different? I guess prompted by so many people saying, oh, the internet, all it does is bring us hoaxes and rumours and things that aren't true, which of course it does, but I think there are also some really great examples of how you can use digital technology to bring quality journalism to your audiences. One really great example is ProPublica. I don't know if many of you have had a look at them. They're a US-based site, but one of the stories I think is really still one of the best examples of great open journalism is their Dollars for Docs story, where essentially they compiled some data that showed which doctors in America were being paid by pharmaceutical companies and how much they were being paid. But instead of just doing that, which is what you would have done if you were a newspaper in 1980, but when you're a digital news organisation in 2012 or whenever it was that they did it, they built it into a fully searchable public database. So you could go on as Jenny from California and you could look up your local doctor and see that Pfizer was paying your local doctor millions of dollars to go to conferences and to prescribe their drugs, essentially. It's a really powerful piece of journalism that wasn't possible before the internet, and to tell that story in the same way and to invite the audience to participate in that. That's the sort of thing I'd like to see more of in the digital age. I think when we're in our own news organisations thinking about our editorial standards for the future and for digital, I'd like to see a bigger commitment to transparency. I think we talk about it, but we still don't walk the walk yet. We don't necessarily explain where we got our information from or why we did a story in the way that we did. I'm really hoping for more open forms of journalism, you know, open data, open code, sharing information. And I don't just mean that because it's good for us as journalists to share those tools, but I think it's also good for the audience. It's good for them to know how we did things and why we did things a certain way. And I think opening up your editorial processes and the way you operate in your newsroom is really fascinating to your audience. Why did you lead with a certain story? Why did you decide to use a particular infograph? That stuff is interesting to your readers. There's been a lot of talk about the voice that you use on social, the voice that you use in digital being slightly different. Again, if you look at, you know, the New York Times is one of the better examples, I guess, of that somewhat cold, neutral voice. That's changing, obviously, when individual bloggers or individual journalists have a brand because of their voice, the way they write, the way they speak. I think we have to acknowledge that and allow more room for journalism that is driven by the journalist. I think analysis, I guess what I would say about that, though, is I'm not advocating for just masses of opinion. I think good opinion writers still root their work in analysis. They show you why they've got that opinion. I think the internet brings us greater breadth of ideas, perspectives. We can go to lots of different places to get information. We can have interaction with our audience that places them at the heart of the story instead of the journalist. And I think we can provide much better context. So you can build a richer, deeper story on the internet than you ever could on a television show or a radio show or a newspaper. And these are the ways to do it. I guess, you know, some of them I've touched on, but the one that I'm most interested in at the moment is around impartiality. There's been a bit of a push to, you know, transparency is the new objectivity. I personally don't think it is. I think it's a step in that direction, but I still think we also need some news organisations to still be impartial and to dispassionately weigh up all the evidence and come down, let the story come down where that weight of evidence exists. So that's just sort of a snapshot of some of the organisations I spent time with and some of the, I think, the better journalism that exists in the digital age. I'm very happy to take some questions. I've written a paper. I looked at 3 legacy organisations, which were the BBC, the New York Times, and another one which is failing me at the moment, The Guardian, sorry, and I looked at 3 digital natives, which were BuzzFeed, Vice and Quartz. I have written a paper. I've got just a 3-page executive summary here if anyone wants to take one away, and a few links that I think are interesting, but I'm happy to take questions. Use mine if you like.
Oh, good. Thanks for that. It was a really insightful presentation. My question is, how do you interpret impartiality when, or the thought of us being truly impartial when an editor actually commissions out of their own experience? So a certain story will be more interesting for an editor than another simply because they're a person, you know, so aren't we subjective?
Yeah, so good question. Of course, we all come from, you know, we all have our cultural baggage and our perspective on life, and I'm not in any way saying that you shouldn't bring that to your journalism. But I guess I still think that as journalists, our job is about truth-telling, and our job is to dispassionately weigh up all the different parts of a story and to let the evidence drive the story rather than our own personal perspectives. So to me, impartiality, it doesn't mean, I think it's been misrepresented as a, you know, people like Jay Rosen call it a he said, she said mindset. I mean, that's not impartial journalism, that's just lazy, bad journalism. And you can have lazy, bad, impartial journalism, and you can have lazy, bad, subjective journalism. But I think what I'm arguing for is that there is still room for stories to be told where a journalist doesn't have skin in the game or the editor doesn't have skin in the game, and I think that's still powerful, especially amid all of the noise that's going on and all the opinion. I mean, opinion is cheap on the internet, you know. What is priceless is a voice that doesn't have an axe to grind. I think that's still really powerful for audiences, and I think there are people who seek that out. That's why they go to the BBC or the ABC or wherever it is, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I just caution against moving entirely to subjective reporting. I think that's fine. I think people like Vice have a place, absolutely. But I just also think there's room for a more impartial approach. Any other questions? No other questions? No, okay. Well, thank you. I'm happy to chat to anyone in the next few days if you're interested and or you want to link to anything that I've worked on. I'm happy to provide that as well. Thank you. I spent 30 hours getting here, so I'm glad that you came. Through a few examples from different news organisations that might be helpful to you as you start to navigate the space yourself. I'm just going to focus today on what I think are the three most important areas of editorial quality, which are accuracy, making sure we get things right and that we're verifying our information. The second is independence. So for me in particular, when I belong to a publicly funded broadcaster, we have no, Rupert Murdoch doesn't own us, so independence is incredibly important to us. No one has any skin in the game. We're not there for the advertisers. And the third thing is impartiality. So again, there's been a big debate around whether objectivity is still needed in 21st century journalism. And I've sort of thought a lot about that, and we'll talk about some of that later. So firstly, to accuracy. One of the more fascinating places I spent some time was with the BBC's user-generated content hub in London by this tension, because to me we were having this sort of wrong conversation. So I became quite interested in how do you uphold all the best things about journalism, whether they be independence, accuracy, a commitment to impartiality in the case of my organisation. How do you protect those things but still be innovative in the digital space? So I went to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford last year to spend a little bit of time unpacking this. And really what I was interested in was what are the hallmarks of editorial quality that existed in the legacy era that we should bring forward? And then what are the ones or the new sorts of standards that some digital-only outlets have, because they don't have that legacy mindset. They're not kind of constrained by the shackles of 150 years of history. And what can they teach us about quality journalism? So today I'm really going to just run. I'm very used to starting at the top of clock, no matter what happens. So I might get started. My name's Kelly Reardon. I'm from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. We are a little like the BBC, but with far less resources, fewer people, a much smaller budget. But we're a publicly funded national broadcaster. My background is predominantly as a radio journalist, but I have been very interested in digital as it starts to flourish. And like some of you in your organisations, I'm sure, we've been having a big internal conversation about, what digital means for our content and our content delivery, and also, what it means for standards. And there was a bit of a tension for a while there between legacy journalists and then the sort of so-called fleet of foot digital natives. And I was quite frustrated. They're looking at videos coming out of Syria, doing all sorts of work to verify if they're correct. And also when Saddam Hussein died, there was this picture sort of doing the rounds of his corpse, and it was the BBC UCG hub that was able to say, actually, this is a fake picture. So I think they're a really good example of how a very small team of people can verify information. And I think what's interesting is that digital, unlike sort of traditional journalism where our job as journalists was to get things right and to be accurate, I think it's equally important in the 21st century now that journalists are also debunking information and pointing out what's not real, and that's becoming part of our trade as well. So again, here's a couple of quick examples. Does anyone know if this photo is real or fake? This is from Hurricane Sandy in the US. That one's actually real. It looks like a movie set picture. But that one was where this hub started in 2005. I think there were only probably 2 of them at the time. And fortunately for them, they set themselves up only a week before the 2005 London bombings. And if you can recall, at first when those bombings happened, people thought there was a power problem on the tube, the subway. And it wasn't until a doctor who was in his office across the road emailed a picture. He must have been one of the first people with a phone that could email a picture to someone at the BBC, and it was the picture of the bus. You can remember the bus on the street with the sort of exploded top. And that was the first kind of signal to the BBC that something more sinister was going on. Fast forward 10 years and this hub is now doing amazing sort of CSI detective work, and they're using all sorts of great tools, reverse image searches, things like Pipple, Topsy. These are all tools that you can have a look at if you haven't explored them before, if you're interested in verification.